Social neuroscience is what we would call an emerging area, a new area. Because even cognitive neuroscience, which has only been around since the early 1990s, is a new field. What does it mean? It means that we now have better methods, better instruments to interrogate the brain directly. Psychologists are people who study how the mind works. How do we normally study the mind? We study it by observing behavior and measuring behavior. I have to click a key on a keyboard. I have to answer a question. You might even measure how much do I smile, how much do I frown, which muscles are moving. These are all different ways in which that we use to try to find out what's going on inside. Because this is not transparent. It is locked in a nice box. And we have to figure out in the science of psychology, what is that thing between our ears doing? And it is a very hard job. It is incredibly hard to figure out what are the right inferences. How do we know? It is not different from asking the question of what was the origin of the universe. That's a very hard question because we cannot go to the origin of the universe and unfold that tape and just observe what happened when the universe was formed. Although these days, maybe we're getting better and better and better at getting further and further away from now to say, aha, we now know that the universe is X billion years older. And so likewise, I would say, we look for instruments. One of the most important of these techniques is something called fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. It is like MRI, which many people are aware of because they've had to have their knee or their neck scanned, where through an MRI you get a very nice picture of the anatomy of your body, some part of your body. We're not interested in the anatomy of the brain. We are roughly interested in it, but much more we're interested in the F that is placed before MRI, fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And what fMRI does is allows access to the workings of the brain by looking at the amount of blood that is going to particular parts of the brain when we are thinking particular thoughts. But we don't have a direct measure of blood flow. We have a proxy. We can estimate how much blood is flowing by looking at the amount of oxygen that is being released in different. The idea is more blood, more oxygen. So we can measure oxygen levels and get something called a bold signal. And looking at that, we can see where different thinking is happening. Now, the interest here in social neuroscience is that when I sit thinking about the mind of another person, is my brain doing the same thing as when I sit around thinking about my office, about the chair in my office? Does my brain use the same regions of the brain to think about how is my chair put together? My chair is a very fancy chair. It allows me to move and does all kinds of things because I have a bad back. So I have a fancy chair that has many moving parts. And so when I think, how does my chair work? Does my brain do the same thing roughly as if I ask something about my student? How does my student, Anne, think about this? And my impression had been that, of course, the brain is only that small, 3 pounds. It cannot have different regions to think about chair versus Anne versus this and that. So my assumption was that we have a general purpose system here. It will use some resource to analyze how something works. And that whether it's a chair or a person, it'll be doing roughly the same thing. And I was quite surprised when the data showed that I'm completely wrong. That for human brains, other people are very special. We think about other people in a very particular way, and we reserve certain regions of the brain to do the work to try to understand why this person did something or why did they do something. So if I ask you a simple question, which has more strings, a violin or a guitar? You think about it and you give me an answer. Okay? If I say to you, who is more likely to carry a hammer, a carpenter or a lawyer? You have an answer. It's based on some fact or some base rate of who's going to do more. It turns out that our brain does not think these two questions the same way. It will answer the question about the instruments because they are physical objects that are not social. It will answer that question using a particular set of regions of the brain, and those are completely separate and different from answering the question, who is more likely to carry a hammer, a carpenter or a lawyer? Carpenters and lawyers are social beings. If I say, who's more likely to wear a tuxedo, a man or a woman? You know the answer to that question, but to give that answer, your brain is using a very different region than it would use to answer the question about violins and guitars, let's say. All right, so now we know this result. It's a result that came out of our lab in the work of a very wonderful colleague of mine called Jason Mitchell. And Jason has been doing this work looking at how is the social world represented differently in our minds than the physical world. And it turns out that there are different networks in the brain that are being used to do this. I will give you one example that goes a little bit further, and it's quite interesting. Let's say that you are similar to me. Let us say that you are a political liberal. And I don't know what your politics are. I don't know what anybody's politics are. But let me imagine that I meet somebody and I say, I find out what are their politics, and let's say that they're liberal. And let us imagine that I happen to be liberal. Okay? I'm not going to tell you what I am, but I can just... Now that person becomes similar to me. But imagine that I meet somebody and that person is a conservative person. And let's say I am liberal. Now this person is different from me. It turns out in the research that we did that we find that when we think about these two different kinds of people, again, our brain is trying to separate them in some way to say this one is like me, this one is not like me. And we actually use slightly different parts of our brain to even do the thinking about them. To us, this has some deep moral interests because it says that a judge, a police officer, a teacher, they're not approaching everybody thinking who's similar or different consciously. They think they're being quite fair. They're being the same with both people. But these data suggest that they're actually using different parts of neural real estate to be doing the thinking about these folks. And what's interesting is that the neurons that are being used to think about the similar other, they happen to be in a region that we'll call the ventral area of medial prefrontal cortex. So those are the neurons that are used to think about the similar other, which are also the neurons that we use to think about ourselves. And that's very interesting. I'm special to me. And so when I'm special to me, I also take other people who are politically similar and I represent them in the same place in my brain where I might represent myself. But the conservative other or somebody who might be different from me, if I'm liberal, then that person gets moved to a more dorsal part of medial prefrontal cortex in the kind of structures that are coming online to do the thinking about them. This is extremely important for us to know. It's important for us to know because we continue to live our lives believing that that's not happening, that we are treating everybody the same. And this science is beginning to show us that in fact our brains very early in thinking about people might be using very different parts of the brain to do the thinking that may lead us eventually to very different conclusions about these people. Now, is it possible that the study we did with political difference these differences can also be observed with other kinds of differences? Racial difference, gender difference, age difference, nationality difference, even language differences, and so on. We do not know the answer to that question because we have not done the full range of those kinds of studies. What we do know from other work is that it probably does matter. So I'll give you, I'll provide one example. In Italy, this was a study that was done. You have to watch a video, and the video is the video of a hand into which an injection is being placed. So a needle, like a doctor's syringe, is being put on the hand and you watch the needle entering the hand. Most of us, when we see that, something happens to us. Our fingers will, get a little more wet from sweat because we found that to be a little bit aversive, a little not very nice. Now, here's the interesting thing about the study. You change the hand into which the needle is going. It can be either a black person's hand or a white person's hand. Will I, when I watch a video of a black person being possibly in pain versus a white person being possibly in pain, will my body respond the same way? Well, the idea here is that if you care equally, it should be the same. But if you don't care as much about one person over the other, the amount of sweat that your fingers will produce should vary. And this study showed, indeed, that certainly for white Italians, what we call skin conductance levels, the amount of sweat that your body produces when you see such a thing, is less when it is a black hand that is receiving the injection compared to a white hand. Now, so these might again suggest, we don't have the data from the brain, but there are lots of other results that we can use to show that there are indeed differences in the way in which we think about other people. And the important thing here is that we are not aware of that. You know, consciously, if you ask me, how do you feel about black and white people, I'll say I love them all equally. But the results show that I do not. And now I have to come face to face with that, and this is why the science is so important. You know how when you take a telescope in an older science, like in astronomy, and you turn it outside and you see things happening amongst planets, and that theory of what is happening there, the data are not fitting with your theory. Galileo had that experience, right? I would say that for us as 21st century mind scientists, we have exactly the same problem that we face. Many of the things that we believed about ourselves are going to be shown to be not true. And we have to be ready to deal with those. There is a very interesting question of what is it that I would want to know the answer to that we don't know about yet in this area of social neuroscience. Almost nothing is known in social neuroscience, so everything remains to be understood. But I think the big question is really, in a sense, the question of consciousness. At some point, our species evolved in a different way so that we achieved something that we call conscious awareness. We have this property. We can look inside our own minds and we can try to figure out what's there. And if we don't like it, we can change ourselves and do something different. No other species has this capacity. And I think what we call sort of the hard problem of consciousness is basically trying to understand what is it that this thing that we call consciousness is, and how does it differentiate us from other species, and what are the things that we can do to change ourselves once we understand ourselves a little bit better.
Studies of social cognition emerged more or less at the end of the 20th century, and interestingly and coincidentally, so did the possibility of studying how the brain works. I was lucky enough to be involved in the development of neuroimaging from its earliest days, which were in the late 1980s, which started with PET scanning and then went on to functional fMRI, which is a way, and both these methods are ways of looking at a living, healthy human brain and asking which bits of it become active when you're doing certain tasks. And because I was involved in imaging from the very start, I was also involved in studying social cognition using brain imaging from the very start. And for example, you can put people in a scanner and you can show them faces and you can see which bits of the brain light up, as we call it. And one of the early studies that I was involved in is looking at what happens when you see a fearful face. And we found, and others have found it too, that a particular bit of the brain called the amygdala, which is deep inside the anterior temporal lobe, lights up when you see a fearful face. And indeed, when you see a fearful face, you also feel a bit fearful yourself, and you get similar. So the amygdala responds to all sorts of fear-inducing stimuli, including fearful faces. And interestingly, it will light up even if the face is presented so quickly, and if it's masked by a face with a neutral expression so that you're unaware of seeing the fearful expression, the amygdala will still light up. So this was one of the things, and this is an important finding in relating, talking about the neural basis of social cognition. The other thing that happened at around this time, which didn't involve me or neuroimaging, was Giacomo Rizzolatti and his group in Italy, again in the late 20th century, discovered mirror neurons. Now, mirror neurons are neurons that become active when you make an action, like picking up a peanut. But they also become active when you see somebody else doing the same thing, picking up a peanut. And that's why they're called mirror neurons, because they're both to do with what you do and what you perceive. Now, these were discovered in the brains of monkeys, in fact, in the motor cortex of monkeys, and are a nice example of something that was discovered by accident, because these researchers were interested in the motor system. So they were interested in, then they showed that there are some neurons that respond to precision grips like this, and other neurons that respond to power grips like this. And they had electrodes implanted in these neurons so they could study their properties. And then one day in the lab, they were eating their lunch or something when the monkey was watching, and the neurons started activating, and then they followed this up. So that they showed that the monkey the neuron would respond when the monkey picked up the peanut, and also when it saw Rizzolatti picking up the peanut. This had a huge impact on the study of the neural basis of social cognition. I was involved again working with brain imaging machines where we could show similar effects in people. Although now, of course, you're not looking at single neurons, you're looking at thousands of neurons. But I think it's fairly well established that there is a similar mirror system in people. And you can also show that it's not just for actions like picking up peanuts, but it's for emotions, as I was saying earlier about fear. So when you see fear, you feel fear. When you see someone's face being touched, you actually feel it in your own face, not consciously, but the relevant bit of the brain is activated. That would be activated if your own face was touched. So there are many of these mirror systems. In the early days, after mirror neurons were discovered, people, I think, rightly became very excited, but they somewhat exaggerated what they thought these neurons might be doing. So there are two questions. First of all, you have the question, how is it? How do you solve what is called the correspondence problem? That is to say, the relationship between seeing an action and performing an action. How can activity in the visual system be converted into activity in the motor system? Because there's no direct connection. And in a sense, the mirror neurons they reveal that the brain does this, but they don't tell you how the brain does it. And this became extremely interesting to everybody. And the other problem with the early response to mirror neurons is people said, this explains how we can read other people's minds. Or in a more simple way, when we see someone acting, we can automatically work out what their goal is, what their intentions are, why they're doing this. And with further research, of course, showed that life is much more complicated than that. There are now quite interesting attempts to solve some of these problems. So the first question is, how do you get the relationship between seeing an action and performing an action? And one current idea is that this is done by association learning, which is a fundamental property of what the brain does, going right back to Pavlov. Hearing the bell conditions the dog to salivate. In the same way we would seeing the hand moving conditions you to feel like what it would be to move your own hand. And of course, we do constantly see our own hands moving so that we can build up the association. And very young infants spend a lot of their time waving their hands about in front of their eyes, which is probably again building up this association and creating the possibility of mirror neurons. The other problem, though, is how do you link? How can you work out by looking at someone, or talking to someone for that matter, what their intentions are, what their beliefs are? This is sometimes known as theory of mind, or mentalizing, the ability to read minds. Now, going back to brain imaging, one of the very early studies that we did at the end of the 20th century, it was to put people in a scanner and give them problems to solve which involved thinking about what another person is thinking about. The very basic task which was developed in children is this Sally Ann task, which my wife Uta Frith was involved with, where you have to recognize that Sally will look in the place where she believes the marble is and not where it actually is. So that beliefs are what counts in predicting somebody's behavior. And you can put someone in a scanner and present them with problems a bit like the Sally Ann task, like where will she look? And you can show that particular brain regions are activated when you perform this kind of task, which involves thinking about other people's mental states, or even thinking about your own mental states. And interestingly, these are not the same areas as the areas where the mirror neurons are found. So it seems to be a different system. And I think I would have to confess that we still don't really know what these brain areas are doing and what the mechanisms are. But we have some ideas. So if you have considered the problem of working out someone's intentions from their actions, a simple version of how you might read someone's intentions from their actions is that you see the action and your mirror neuron system works out what you would be doing, why you would be doing such an action, and that gives you the goal. But there's a problem, and the analogy is with the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So Dr. Jekyll is a good surgeon who cures people. Mr. Hyde, who's the alter ego of Dr. Jekyll, is an evil person who wants to harm people. So if you see this person who looks identical, holding a scalpel and cutting someone, how do you know whether it's Mr. Hyde being nasty or Dr. Jekyll being kind? And the solution to this is to say you have to have some prior idea of who you're looking at, or you have some prediction about why this person is doing what he is doing. So it's not enough just to see the action. You have to have some expectation of why the person is acting like that, on the basis of which you can predict precisely what they will do next. And if they do something different from what you expect, you have to update your expectation of why they were doing this. So this is how we are currently thinking about how the brain solves these mentalizing problems. And for example, the temporal parietal junction seems to have an important role in mentalizing. And this seems to be an area which is interested in what the intentions are of the person you're observing, and becomes particularly excited if they do something different from what you expect, which we would call a prediction error, which is crucial in working out precisely why they're doing what they are doing. Another interesting aspect of social cognition and the neural basis of this has been discovered in relation to biological motion. So biological motion is this ability to recognize that from very simple motion cues that we are seeing a person walking, or an animal, or a person who's happy or sad. And again, one of the early studies that was done with the brain imaging machines was to put people in the scanner and present them with biological motion. And again, you find a very specific area of the brain becomes active. There is, of course, a well-known area of the brain called V5, at least in the UK, but MT in America, which is interested in motion in general. Anything that moves will activate this area. But there's another area not far away, slightly higher up in the temporal cortex, which is specifically concerned with biological motion. And we believe that it's this biological motion system that feeds the information up into the mentalizing system. So it provides the kinematic information on which you now start to speculate upon how people or why people are doing what they're doing. Neuroimaging had a big impact on the study of social cognition because it revealed discrete brain areas concerned with particular aspects of social cognition, like emotion expression. But also, I think the biggest impact, of course, was the discovery of mirror neurons, and that there are many aspects of social cognition that involve mirroring. And one of these is emotional expressions. So when we see someone with an emotional expression, we tend to mirror this. If I see someone with a happy expression, I will to some extent feel happy. And this, of course, people became very excited about because it provides perhaps a neural basis for empathy. Well, I am an experimental psychologist at heart, and which is a young subject. You know, it started at the end of the 19th century. And cognitive psychology is even later. That started in the middle of the 20th century and replaced behaviorism as the main way of studying people. And the cognitive in cognitive psychology essentially refers to the fact that we're using computers as a metaphor, or information processing. So we talk about memory and storage, we talk about perception and templates. And social cognition arrived even later, at around the end of the 20th century. And initially, as the name implies, it was about applying the ideas of cognitive psychology to social psychology. And in the early days, this meant things like, how do we recognize emotions in people's faces? And that has two components, because we could be talking about people's fleeting moods. Are they angry? Are they sad? Are they disgusted? Or it could be talking about people's dispositions, like, is this person trustworthy? Is this a nice person? And that, of course, leads into things like prejudices, race prejudices, dehumanizing people, and all that sort of thing. Another aspect of social cognition at that time, which became very interesting to everybody, was the discovery of something called biological motion, which was invented, or I should say was discovered by Johansson in Sweden, where he did this very clever experiment where he took people, he attached lights to their joints, so you would have a light on your wrist, on your elbow, on your shoulder, and then you can film people where all you see is the lights, you don't see the people. And just from this very minimal information, you can see whether the person is walking or running, whether they're male or female, whether they're happy or sad. And this became a technique for experimentally studying one aspect of social perception, if you like. The key difference between cognitive psychology and behaviorism was that cognitive psychologists wanted to know what was happening in the mind and were not just looking at behavior. So they were concerned with what people were thinking, what they were introspecting, and, for example, how they solved problems, how they thought about problems in order to solve them. So cognitive psychologists were very interested in memory, attention, and perception. And, for example, you can show that how well you can perceive something depends on whether you're attending to it or whether it comes out of the blue. You can ask what is it that people attend to when they're confronted with a complicated scene. And one of the things that was shown by in social cognition is that the first thing we attend to is faces. If there's a face in the picture, that's what we look at first. And indeed, I'm reminded that there was a famous Russian psychologist called Yarbus, who studied eye movements very early on in this field, and he showed how people actually look at faces in paintings and so on. So that was the way that social cognition developed. There are various questions that we study in social cognition which are still not really answered. So one question is social cognition something special? Are the ways that we interact with other people different from the ways that we interact with physical objects in the world? Are the ways that we attend to people different from the way we attend to trees or animals or something like that? Yes, so there's been a great deal of work in social cognition on the recognition of emotions in faces. And in the early days, this depended on basically taking photographs of actors representing emotions. And it turned out that there are roughly 5 different emotions that everybody can recognize across cultures, which I probably can't remember all of them, but it's happiness, sadness, disgust, surprise, and one other. And there are obviously problems with this because, for example, we recognize happiness by a smile. And it turned out in this research that there are actually 2 kinds of smile. There's a genuine smile, and there's something which is known as the Duchenne smile, which refers to the particular muscles involved, which is a sort of fake smile. And so people were very worried about using actors as our basic material for presenting emotions because, in a sense, unless they're extremely good actors, they may be producing the fake version. Now, more recently, a chap called Alex Todorov at Princeton, in the last 20 years or so, has managed to produce computerized versions of faces. So you don't need an actor, you actually have what they call a face space in which you can present different faces and you have dimensions. The way the faces are generated is based on the real muscles in the face. So you're actually simulating the expressions that can be produced by human faces. And one interesting feature or one important aspect of a face is how trustworthy it is. And what you can show here is that you can easily generate faces that look trustworthy and faces that look untrustworthy. Everybody will agree that this face looks trustworthy and this face looks untrustworthy, but this almost certainly has nothing to do with reality. That is to say, someone with a face like this is not necessarily actually trustworthy. It's just that we have this social consensus about what a trustworthy face is. And interestingly, you can speculate, and this is something that is not yet fully confirmed, that if you have the advantage to be born with a trustworthy face, you can take advantage of this. Well, I think social cognition is very important because it directly concerns our everyday lives, and not just our everyday lives, but I mean social life in general. Social cognition is not relevant simply to how I talk to you at this moment and how I'm responding to your micro-expressions as I talk to you, but also at a much larger scale, how do groups interact, how do societies work, and something that's obviously particularly concerning me at this moment. Why on earth did the UK vote to leave the European Union? Social cognition will enable us to understand how some of these mechanisms actually work.
Theory of mind is a pervasive human ability that we didn't even suspect existed until we studied autism. That's why it's very important when you talk about theory of mind also to talk about autism. Theory of mind is a nickname. It's really intended to refer to the ability that we all have, we human beings, to understand other human beings, not in terms of how they behave, what they do, but in terms of what they feel and think. So, totally invisible things in your head, but we have a theory of what happens in your mind. It's not a theory like philosophers have. It's not an explicit theory. It's an intuition. So we behave all the time as if we knew that beliefs and desires and feelings actually enable us to project what we're going to do next. So if John leaves the house with an umbrella, the reason is not that it's raining. It may not be raining at all. But the reason is John believes it will rain. It has nothing to do with reality. It has to do with his belief. So that particular ability is what we hypothesize is missing in autism. And that is why they have this very interesting and typical inability to engage with other people in a reciprocal fashion. They can't track millisecond by millisecond what somebody else may feel or know or believe. It's as if we had an invisible GPS in our brain which navigates us around the social world, what other people do, without us even thinking about it. In the case of autism, they have to use a map, which is much more cumbersome. It takes much more time. We all love the idea of a navigator in our cars. We can do things. The navigator does things for us that we don't have to think about. It'll point us into the right direction. And so theory of mind is an ability for which we coin the nonsense word, mentalizing. So we can mentalize and thereby have an advantage by being able to project and explain what somebody is doing, why they're doing it. And of course, one of the things that mentalizing enables people to do is to lie. It gives you the ability to tell whether you know something and whether I can insert a false belief into your mind. I then have to track this. So it's a hugely important tool in our social interaction, not always for the good. One of the things that has been said about autistic people is that they don't lie. And they don't, in fact, understand why ordinary people, they lie all the time. We even lie when we don't need to. For example, just to be nice to somebody, to be very flattering. All of our politeness rules have to do with the kind of unconscious mentalizing program which says we don't want to offend them. It is clear that we are taking feedback all the time, and we will see whether we have gone wrong in what we are doing and thinking about them. So given that this is such a fanciful idea, which many people would say, wow, this is ridiculous. How can you postulate that is an ability, like the ability to, hear or to see? colors. Well, I think it is just like that. It's just like an ability to see colors, an ability to see the invisible mental states of others. And therefore, it has a basis in the brain. And we could show this using neuroimaging methods. We could make people do tasks which demand that you think of mental states and contrast them with tasks that are exactly the same in every possible way, but you don't have to invoke mental states. These are, for example, movements of objects like cause and effect, while when we are thinking about intentions and beliefs, they can also be expressed in movements, but you will interpret the movement completely differently, intentionally and deliberately, not just as a physical cause and effect. And we can compare when people watch little films, when they read stories, all sorts of different methods have been used. See what happens in their brain in these two situations, subtract activity in the brain between these two conditions, and what we can see is a particular network of regions, and that's a robust network. It's frontal regions, temporal regions, and they are very, very well connected in the normal case and not so well connected in the case of autism. So there is a biological basis for theory of mind. So thinking about mentalizing and theory of mind has really changed the way we look at the development of the human mind and the evolution of the human mind. So one question that you need to ask immediately is, where does this come from in evolution? Is it really human specific? And this is where the future work will be. And already there are studies that show that other animals have some beginnings of this very same ability. A very interesting study has been carried out with birds, with very clever birds, the corvid family, who hide food. And if they know that they are observed by another bird, they will later on take away the hidden food and put it somewhere else. This is theory of mind. Now, it is very reasonable to suppose that maybe this also happens in other species, and it'd be very interesting to see that. But this is a kind of theory of mind that is totally without language. We believe that human beings have possibly two forms of theory of mind, the very, very automatic one, and another one which has a lot to do with language, and which can be used in order to reflect on our own mind. So that's another way that the future study will have to go. We'll have to see, why is it so special for human beings that they can consciously reflect on what they think and intend and feel. So there is a lot to be done still in research on theory of mind. We need to know whether there is an implicit automatic form, whether we share that with other animals, and whether there is an explicit conscious form of theory of mind. Perhaps there are even other forms that have not even been discovered yet. We need to know whether in ordinary child development the explicit theory of mind builds on the other automatic implicit theory of mind, or whether it is completely independent. At this moment, these are all open questions. Sometimes people mistake theory of mind and mentalizing for empathy. It sounds like, yeah, sort of related. And yet, we have found through the study of autism, through the methods of brain imaging, that these are quite separate things. So even though mentalizing means taking feelings into account or tracking changes in feelings, empathy is quite a different sort of ability. And empathy rests on a different brain system, a brain system that has to do with something like contagion. So what you feel, I feel too. If you laugh, I will laugh slightly. I might not show it, but we have shown through using very, very small devices on the face that the muscles that are to do with laughing will be activated, will be ready to laugh when another person laughs. So this is a kind of automatic mechanism that we can say is a primary form of empathy, so that we do indeed feel the other's pain, we also feel the other's joy. But that is something quite separate. And the fascinating thing is that in autism, this is actually very often intact and present. So it's not the case that in autism all social abilities are missing. It's just this mentalizing that's missing.
One of the major topics in social cognition has, from the very beginning, has been the study of how we recognize the expressions in faces. And turns out there are the 5 basic expressions, which include happiness, sadness, disgust, fear, and surprise. When brain imaging was added to the mix, it was possible to identify brain regions that were particularly concerned with these kinds of expressions, like the amygdala is very interested in fear, the insula is very interested in disgust. But also it was found that our response to emotional expressions in faces is part of the mirror system. This is the system where we have common neural basis for recognizing something and for doing something. So when I see a happy expression or a fearful expression, the same bits of the brain light up as when I feel happy or when I feel fear. And people immediately recognize that this might be an interesting basis for empathy. But it turns out that empathy is actually rather complicated. One of the things I find fascinating is that the word doesn't come into the English language until the beginning of the 20th century, which is remarkably late. It comes from the German word Einfühlung, which is to feel yourself into a situation. And people used to talk about how you would appreciate art because somehow the picture that you're looking at causes you to feel the emotions that the artist is trying to present to you. And the discovery of this mirroring system in the brain seemed to be a direct representation of this kind of experience. But as I said, things are slightly more complicated. So one of the first things that was found when we were imaging responses to fear, for example, is that you'll get a fearful response even if the face is presented so quickly that you're not aware that you have seen a fearful face. And other people in Sweden also demonstrated that you can measure expression changes in your own face by recording activity in muscles, and you can show that your muscles are activated so that you're actually generating a fearful expression in your muscles when you see this face. And again, this happens even if you're not aware that you have seen a fearful face. So this doesn't sound to me like empathy, because our usual understanding of empathy is I somehow notice that you're feeling a certain emotion, and I am aware that you're feeling a certain emotion, and I may feel it myself, and I may want to actually do something about it. So if you're feeling very unhappy, I may want to cheer you up. But this very basic neural empathy, which you're not even aware that you have seen the fearful expression, might better be called contagion. And people often call this emotional contagion, and you can get motor contagion when you tend to imitate the actions of others and so on, without knowing that you're doing it. So probably there are at least 3 levels of empathy. There's emotional contagion, where I feel your emotion even though I'm not aware that it's your emotion or that I'm feeling it. There's I feel your emotion and know that it's your emotion and not my emotion, although I am reflecting it to some extent. And then at the other extreme, there's I know that you're having an emotion, and as a result of this, I want to help you. So if you're feeling sad, I want to cheer you up. And it would seem to me the case that if you're feeling sad and I start feeling sad as well, this is probably not the best way to achieve this. And there are even more important situations whereby if I see an angry expression, it's probably not ideal to be angry myself. So things become more complicated as soon as you bring in these higher level cognitive processes into the study of empathy. Another mirror system exists for pain, which again depends in part on facial expressions. So if I see someone with an expression of pain, I will also feel that emotion, if one can call it an emotion, but you can do this more directly. You can actually show people receiving painful stimuli. So this has been done in various ways, but for example, you see the hand of, you're in the scanner, and on the screen in front of you, you see somebody's hand and you see a needle sticking into it, or you see a cotton bud stroking it. And the interesting thing here is that when you see a needle sticking into someone's hand, the areas in your brain that respond to pain light up, which is the anterior cingulate and the anterior insula. And these are the same areas that light up when you yourself have a needle stuck into you in the scanner. So there's this overlap. And they will even light up when, rather than seeing someone having a needle stuck into them, you're simply told when the light goes on, the person is going to receive a painful stimuli. So simply knowing when your companion is going to receive this painful stimuli, you see a painful response in yourself. And again, this can be an example of empathy. But again, life is more complicated. You can then ask the question, does it matter who you see getting the painful stimuli? And one experiment that I did with Tanya Singer, she manipulated people's belief about who it was that was getting the pain. So basically she made them believe that this was a nice person or a nasty person. And this was done by having these people who were actually actors who were brought in for the experiment play a game with the subject of the experiment or the participant in the experiment, and one actor was told to cheat and the other actor is told to be cooperative. And they very rapidly get a reputation for being nice or nasty. And then when you see them getting the pain in the scanner, you're much less responsive if it's the nasty person getting this pain, particularly if you're a man. And there was even some suggestion that men, in particular, when they saw the nasty person getting the pain, actually the reward system in the brain lit up. So that's one aspect which we may not be surprised about. The other aspect which is more disturbing is that it depends whether the person you see getting the pain is the same race as you or not. So some colleagues in Beijing scanned people and it's actually the setup, but either you had a Caucasian in the scanner and they could see a Caucasian face having a needle stuck into it, or a Chinese face having a needle stuck into it, or it's a Chinese person in the scanner with exactly the same situation. And the Caucasians respond empathetically when they see a Caucasian face getting the painful stimuli and not with a Chinese face, and precisely the reverse with the Chinese participants. So this is a powerful demonstration of how much our empathy is to do with our in-group and not to do with our out-group. You can obviously ask the question, can you overcome this prejudice? And here there are experiments suggesting that this can be done, and there are roughly two ways you can, I guess the main way is to know the people. So all these experiments I've described are done with faces of people you've no idea who they are. If you get to know someone of a different race, if they become part of your team, then the empathy comes back. A very tough question in all this social cognition is the extent to which these processes are innate rather than learned from our culture and our environment. And I would say that this is me speculating, although it's the sorts of experiments that I would like to do in the future. We all come from the factory, as it were, hardwired, but these can be overcome. So certainly very young infants already show signs of prejudice, but depending on the culture in which they find themselves, these can rapidly be overcome. There's a nice experiment, a much simpler kind, about faces again. I seem to be always talking about faces. With these new computerized faces, you can morph between faces of different races or different people from different countries. So you can have a Caucasian face at one end and a Japanese face at the other end, and you can have all possible intermediate faces. You can then ask people in different cultures, in a sense, where the cutoff is. So if you ask people in America, at what point does it no longer look like an American face? It's much closer to the American than it is to the Japanese. If you ask people in Japan, where does it change from a Japanese face to a Caucasian face, it's much closer to the Japanese end. So this is an example of a sort of prejudice, if you like. But this is purely created by the environment in which you find yourself. So if you take an American from America to Japan, where they're now surrounded by Japanese faces, this neutral position moves because it's influenced by the majority of the people that you see. So I think this is a nice example of how these factory settings, as it were, can be modified by the environment in which you find yourself.
Imitation is really, really important because it's a very, very fundamental part of human social interaction. It's something that infants learn from the age of 10 months, 1 year, and engage in extensively throughout their lives. There's been an enormous amount of theorising, starting really with the work of Darwin, who said man is very much an imitative animal, about what is imitation for, why do people imitate so much and so ubiquitously. If you go to any primary school or nursery, you see children imitating each other all the time. Whereas in other species, there may be a little bit of imitation there, but we have to look pretty hard to find it. There's something about humans where imitation seems to be a very, very strong effect, and there have been a lot of different theories proposed for what imitation is doing, particularly that it enables cultural learning. It enables one person to learn something and then another copies, and this can spread and create a culture where everybody in a group learns. So it's a very efficient way of learning things and making information available to many more people in a group. And so this idea that imitation is for learning, for gaining new skills, for letting children learn, whether it's how to tie their shoelaces or what toys are fun to play with in the playground, that's been the dominant theory of imitation for several decades. But we're also finding, and evidence is increasingly emerging, that imitation is a very, very social thing. People engage in imitation even when they're not learning. People engage in imitation in order to connect with other people and to show that they have a social connection with other people. And this seems to be a really, really important and maybe somewhat neglected aspect of imitation, that we're just starting to find good ways to study this and then try and find out what are the brain mechanisms and where does the social kind of imitation come from. So to give one example of the kind of thing that we look at when we're looking at social imitation, we're very interested in what we call an over-imitation task. And this is a really, really simple task that we can do with everyday objects. We're looking at how we just tell people, get the toys out of the box. And we can do this with children. We've also done it with adults. And the participant will see a demonstration of the action. So in the demonstration, they see somebody who does an action and then opens the box and takes the toy out. But the key thing we're interested in here is obviously, I did a silly action. I tapped on top of the box. And we want to know if people will copy that extra action. You don't need to tap on a lid of the box to get the toy out. But it turns out both children and adults, people of all ages, will copy that silly action. So they're not copying actions just because they want to learn how it works. They know perfectly well how Tupperware boxes work. They know perfectly well how to get the toy out. But they will go and do a completely dumb thing just because it's social. Children will do this more if somebody's watching them. They will do it more if they're in a social context, if people are socially engaged with them. And we take this kind of behaviour as a sort of signature of the social nature of imitation. It's not just learning, it really is about connecting with other people. Some more recent studies we've done also look at this particular behaviour in children with autism, because we know that autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder where children really struggle with social interaction. And there have been very mixed reports over the years of what happens when you give children with autism imitation tasks. Tasks that are often done in the classroom or with a therapist in a very natural context. People will report that the children with autism don't imitate, they don't engage in the same way. They say these children really struggle with imitation. And yet when we give the children with autism some quite controlled tasks in the lab where we show them this is a set of actions, now do these same actions, they do it perfectly. So we know that they're capable of imitation. It's not that they're lacking in the motor skills to be able to imitate, but rather when we give them the over-imitation task with the silly action, tapping on top of the box, they just don't bother to copy that silly action. So they're able to imitate, but they're choosing not to. Or rather, the typical children are choosing to imitate too much. And the autistic kids are smarter. They don't bother to do these silly actions that we give them. So again, that's showing us that that the typical children are very, very social. They want to do these actions because they want to be like the adult, because they want to be social. And the children with autism leave out those extra actions. They leave out the stuff you don't need to do, which for the one particular task is more efficient, but more generally it maybe means people feel like this child isn't engaging, and maybe the child is then losing out on some opportunities to learn. They're losing out on the chance to learn that maybe doing the stupid thing sometimes is fun, or sometimes makes your friend laugh, or sometimes gives you a social connection with another person that you wouldn't get in a different way. So we've been able with some very, very simple tasks to actually try and pull apart the basic nature of imitation. And now we're doing some brain imaging studies to understand what are the brain mechanisms that might be different here, and what are the different kinds of social signals that drive imitation. So how do we use imitation in a bigger variety of social contexts? It's interesting to think about how far people might go with over-imitating actions, with doing silly things. Little children, this is often studied in 4 or 5-year-olds, they can be pretty indiscriminate and they will just do all sorts of silly things and they enjoy doing it because it's fun. Among adults, we find the behaviour is much, much more variable, much more selective, depending on the social context. In some social contexts, people will copy a lot of very silly things, but a teeny tiny change to the social context will mean that they copy very little and they only go for the efficient solution. So adults can do it, but they don't always do it. It will depend, maybe, are they with their friends, who's watching, precisely what have they been told, what do they think the situation is about, because we think that this kind of imitation is giving us a window into some of the much more elaborate social processes that are going on when people are deciding how to act. And again, this kind of over-imitation of unnecessary stuff, may be the kind of thing that we see in a lot of cultural things, in fashion. How do people choose what kind of clothes to wear or what kind of music to listen to? These are fairly arbitrary choices. They don't, one style of coat isn't going to keep the rain off better than another, but teenagers will put a lot of time and energy into choosing who they copy and which styles to wear. And these kind of over-imitation, again, will be sending social signals, and people are very, very subtly tuned in to whether you're wearing the style of coat that the Kardashians wore, the style of coat that somebody else wore, and they'll be using this as social cues. So some of the main questions in the area of imitation is, can we create a sort of overarching theory of what are the different factors that drive over-imitation, and how closely does that tie in to these kind of cultural learning? Like fashion, I've given the example of people copying other fashions, but we'd like to be able to pin down evidence and see what are the mechanisms that drive that, and what kind of things drive your decision to imitate one person over another. It's the kind of thing actually even Facebook or fashion industry are very interested in, because they'd love to find the fashion blogger who's the most influential and what should that person do to make everybody buy their coats. So that's quite a long way off from what we're doing at the moment, but if we can understand what are the mechanisms by which these kind of very basic social processes work, then it does have these much bigger applications for things that change how people behave in the real world. So we can study imitation on many different levels. We can study the imitation on the neuroscience level, so looking at the mechanisms in the brain, putting people in brain scanners and looking at mirror neurons and other brain mechanisms which allow you to perceive actions and perform actions and copy actions. Then we can look at imitation at the level of psychology, which is many of the kind of things that I've talked about, where you're looking at what makes a child imitate a particular action, tapping on the lid of the box, and what different kind of social cues and factors play into that decision to copy something or not copy something. And then we could look at imitation at a sociological or cultural level to see how different trends and fashions spread through a culture, or how knowledge spreads through a particular culture, and how different ideas would be imitated within that culture. So it's a very big topic that spans many different levels of explanation. And if we get a really good idea of what's driving imitation, I think that'll feed into many different areas. One of the questions that's very important in the area of imitation that we're looking at the moment is the question of how people respond to being imitated. There's been a lot of research over the last 10 years, 20 years over how people produce imitation, what makes you imitate another person. But in a social interaction, there's always two halves to the social interaction. If one person copies, the other person will detect, am I being copied? And the dominant idea in the field at the moment is that if somebody copies you, maybe you'll like them more, you'll take that as a compliment. But the evidence for that is rather mixed. And certainly in real life examples, copying can be a form of mockery. We see it with politicians a lot, that if someone on TV wants to mock a politician, sometimes they will copy them as a caricature, as an extreme version of that. So probably the function of imitation, that being imitated is not always a positive thing, but we're working hard to try and find out what are the brain mechanisms of being imitated, and how important is it to be imitated by another person. To do that, we're using things like virtual reality, because you can create virtual reality characters that will copy you or not copy you, and then look at the difference between how people respond to those. And so if we can understand what's the importance of being imitated, that will let us create better virtual characters and create sort of more naturalistic social interactions, or equally train people and coach people in terms of how to make a social interaction more fluent, how to be more persuasive. So there's a lot of applications for using this, but these are still things to come in the future. The problem of how we understand other people has always been a very complicated one, and even in very simple situations, if we see another person pick up a cup of tea, or we see them make a particular symbol with their hands or something, then we're often able to understand, without even thinking about it, what it is that they're doing and what it is that they mean. In the last 2 decades, there's been an enormous amount of research on this area to try and uncover what are the mechanisms in the brain that let us understand other people's behaviour in very simple ways. And there's been a very influential discovery of things called mirror neurons. It's a discovery that was made nearly 20 years ago now by neuroscientists working in Italy, in Parma. And they were studying macaque monkeys as the monkeys move and pick up a peanut. And they found that there were individual neurons in the premotor cortex of the monkey which would respond not only when the monkey picks up a peanut, but also when the monkey sees a person pick up a peanut. So these individual neurons, the sort of basic units of the brain, are linking together the actions that you see and the actions that you do yourself. And these were named mirror neurons, and it has been an incredibly influential discovery because for the first time it gave people a handle on the idea that there could be some very, very basic mechanism in the motor system of the monkey that actually allows you to do something social and link the things that you see up to the actions that you do yourself. So these were discovered now almost 20 years ago, but there's still a lot of controversy over how they work and what they do and how important they really are to our social lives. Some of the things that are very interesting in this area is the question of how important are these neurons for really understanding what another person's doing. So if you see another person grasping an object, do you have to use your mirror neurons to understand that? And we've studied how, for example, if you use a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation, you put a magnet over the outside of a person's head and you can put a pulse through that magnet and deactivate the part of their brain that's underneath the magnet. So this is a very, very rapid thing. It rapidly just disrupts the neurons underneath the magnet. And if you do that over areas like the premotor cortex where people have mirror neurons, and at the same time you're asking people to do quite a difficult task where they have to understand another person, then their performance gets much, much worse. So we've been able to provide some data saying that maybe we think these mirror neurons, or at least these areas of the brain that have mirror neurons, are very important for understanding the behaviour of other people. And certainly we know also if people have strokes that damage these areas, then that can have quite a big impact, not only on their ability to perform actions, but also it may impact on their ability to understand other people. So the mirror neurons are found mainly in 2 areas of the brain, in the premotor cortex and also in the parietal cortex. There's a variety of different ways of classifying them. Some of them are very, very selective. They will only respond if the monkey picks up a peanut and also if the person that they're watching picks up a peanut. But others are much more general and will respond to a variety of actions. So it's been quite controversial as to what the mechanism is and how precise this matching needs to be in order for it to be socially useful. The other question that's been a very big controversy in the area of mirror neurons is the question of where do they come from in terms of evolution. So have we evolved to have mirror neurons, and that this could be a change from millions of years ago, that our mirror neurons got better and better and are there driven by evolution to allow us to interact with other people. Or the rival theory is that actually this is something that we learn throughout our lives, that when babies are born, they don't have any mirror neurons, but that when they see actions and when they do actions, then they make connections between the images that they see in front of them and the actual movements of their hand. And by making those connections, they create mirror neurons. And over the last few years, there's been increasing evidence that we create mirror neurons through performing actions and through observing our own actions and observing the actions of other people. A baby at 4 months old will spend about 40% of its waking time looking at its own hand because it's really learning and working very hard to learn those connections between the image that you see if you took a photograph of your hand and the movements that you make when you send signals to your muscles to move your hand. And we think that those kind of connections are part of what's setting up mirror neurons. We're doing some studies at the moment with some collaborators to look at babies, and we can now record brain activity in babies while they're learning these things and try to see these systems come online as babies develop. An important question that arose when mirror neurons were first discovered was the question of what happens if mirror neurons go wrong, what would go wrong in somebody's brain if these mirror neurons weren't there, and what would be different about them. And very rapidly there was a theory put forward called the broken mirror theory of autism, where some researchers suggested that if you didn't have these mirror neurons, that could be a potential cause of autism. Autism is a developmental disorder where children don't interact with other people in the same way. They often withdraw from other people, and maybe they don't imitate to the same extent. They don't do some of the things that you expect in terms of normal social interaction. And so this idea that these children might have difficulties with their mirror neurons was something that got a lot of popular press. But when we actually turn to look at it rigorously, we find that the idea doesn't really make much sense. So if we test the children on tasks that specifically require them to use their mirror neurons, they do fine. And we put them in brain scanners, we put adults in brain scanners and show them pictures of people doing movements and different kinds of movements, and we find that their mirror neurons respond in just the same way as other people. The brain systems that contain mirror neurons are behaving in the same way. So it's interesting to see, I guess, how this controversy has developed, but how our theories of what's going on in autism need to move on, and we need to find more sophisticated models, because we know there are a lot of differences in these children, but it isn't just due to things that are going wrong with mirror neurons. So we know that macaque monkeys have a small number of mirror neurons, but the kind of methods that we use to look at whether or not you've got mirror neurons, which is either recording inside the brain or doing MRI scans, are methods that we can't do with apes or chimpanzees, because they tend not to like sitting in MRI scans. So we don't know is the answer. We think it's very likely, and especially if you take the view that these neurons are learned, then they would have ample opportunity to learn this, but we don't have any definitive evidence for that yet. So we think that mirror neurons are very important in terms of helping us understand some of the very basic mechanisms of social interaction. And if we've got those basic building blocks, we can then understand how people would build on those for more complex interactions. They're also something that turns out to be very important in motor disorders. So in people who have a stroke, as I said, a stroke can affect your ability to perform actions, if the stroke affects the motor cortex, but also to understand actions. It turns out there may also be some differences, things like people are looking at differences in people with Parkinson's disease who have difficulties performing movements. And this idea that the actions that you can perform help you understand other people's actions is something that seems to be very, very fundamental. So there's some very interesting studies showing that if you learn a new motor skill, if you learn a new type of ballet, then that changes your brain, that changes your mirror neuron system, and gives you a much greater understanding of other people performing that kind of skill. So there's a couple of very interesting studies where, for example, we take people who have never done modern dance before and train them up over the course of 5 weeks to do a particular kind of modern dance, and scan them every week to see how their brain changes, and find that then as they learn the dance, they also show different patterns and more patterns of brain activation in the mirror neuron system as they are able to understand in much more detail and in a much greater fashion the kind of dance that they're seeing when another person is performing the modern dance. So the mirror neuron system really is giving us some sort of key insights into basic mechanisms of visual motor learning and how people acquire new skills and then use those skills in a social way to make sense of other people. So the main questions in the field of mirror neuron research for the future is to understand how does this system relate to other brain systems, how does information from the mirror neuron systems feed into other brain systems that allow us to infer social things about who's nice or who's not nice or who to interact with, and other kinds of social relationships, and similarly to understand the relationship between mirror neurons and emotion processing, because emotions appear in the face. Sometimes we use our own face to copy the emotions that we see, and we don't know yet how much that contributes to let us understand. Do we have mirror neurons for facial emotions? And is it the same principles that we're using in mirror neuron systems that also let us have an emotional connection with other people? And then how the whole sort of puzzle fits together into the broader idea of the social brain. So one of the key questions that came up when we first started studying mirror neurons was the question of what is it that these neurons actually care about. And there's a very interesting feature when you're trying to understand actions and make sense of actions, that an action can be understood on many different levels. So if you saw a person reaching out to a tree to pick an apple, then you could understand that action, you could represent it in your mind in terms of the goal of the action to take an apple from the tree, but you could also think about the shape of the hand without caring about what the object is. You'd have the same shape of the hand to grasp an apple or to grasp a tennis ball or something else. And so it's a very important question to know, does the brain care about hand shapes, or does it care about the object itself that you're taking, the apple or the tennis ball? But because these things are intrinsically linked, it becomes very hard in terms of the methods to separate them out. Every time you show a person a picture or a movie of a person grasping an apple, both the hand shape and the apple are there at once. So we spent some time devising experiments that would let us separate these things out. And we showed that if you show people the same movie twice in a row, then for the second one you get slightly less brain activation, something called repetition suppression. It means that the thing you're seeing maybe has become predictable. So if you see the same hand shape twice in a row, the hand shape for grasping an apple, then the brain activation will be suppressed if that particular region of the brain encodes the shape of the hand. But if you show the same hand shape grasping an apple, and then the next time the same hand shape is grasping a tennis ball, then because you're taking a different object, the brain activation won't be suppressed, but only if the brain actually cares what the identity of the object is. And so we were able to use this method in an MRI scanner with brain imaging to show that there's some areas of your brain that really care about the shape of your hand, whereas there's other areas of the brain that really care about what the object is that you're grasping. And so making these kind of more detailed distinctions is important, first because it will give you a much better interpretation of what's happening, for example, in people who've had a stroke or had some form of brain damage that affects one of these brain areas and not the other. But also almost on a more philosophical level, it's showing that these different concepts we have about things in the everyday world, like grasping a particular kind of an object, really are encoded in particular brain regions, and that we can distinguish within the brain between these different ideas about the goal of an action or the way an action has been performed, which philosophers might have talked about, but we couldn't before sort of see the psychological reality of these kind of concepts and see how they work in the brain. And we think that there's probably mirror neurons that deal with both of these different levels, and then you have to integrate the system together in order to have a whole understanding of what another person's action is and what you're going to do with it.
So my work is basically all about syntax, which is the way that we put words together to create meanings. And most people who do the kind of work that I do on syntax are really interested in the ways that languages vary when they do this. So, in English, you say, you put the verb and then you put the object. In Japanese, you put the object and the verb. In Russian, actually, you can put the object quite far away from the verb quite often. So languages vary in different kinds of ways. And people like me, syntacticians, we're interested in what the system is that humans have that does this variation, right? So what is similar between an English speaker, a Russian speaker, a Chinese speaker, a Nungabuyu speaker in how we build sentences out of the basic bits and pieces we have? And the answers that people have given to that, and the answer that I believe is true, is that what is really similar is that we human beings have a capacity to take discrete units, like words or sounds, and we put them together in hierarchical ways. We put them together in chunks, and those chunks are put together in larger chunks, and those larger chunks are put together in larger chunks. And we do this in a sort of unbounded fashion. That is, we can just continue doing this, following the rules of our particular language, which is what makes our languages so creative. It's what enables me to say the sentences I'm saying just now. So this is a very important part of language, the discrete, the hierarchical, and the unbounded, the unending. And that's what most of my work's about. And that's what most people who do what I do work on. But actually there's more to language than this. So that is a fundamental aspect of the nature of language. But actually when people think about language, they think about more than just this aspect of it. There's something else. There's the way we use language, what we use language to do. We don't use language just to say literal things. We don't just, say, I am sitting on a chair. That would be pretty boring, right? What we do is we use language to express ourselves. We use it to express our thoughts. We use it to express how we're feeling. We use it to express what kind of a person we are. And that, I think, is another aspect of the nature of language that quite often gets lost from the perspective of people like me, who are focused very much on the theory of what human language really is, as far as syntax and grammar and things like that go. So I want to tell you a little bit about some work that I did with my colleagues at Queen Mary, which was about how the variation in language and the sense of self of particular individuals who speak language end up feeding into the kinds of grammatical rules that we have in a language. So this is work that has been done here in London, where we are right now, looking at the new kind of a language that emerges in teenage speak in certain areas of inner London. So if you go to somewhere like Hackney, Dalston, one of these areas of London, it's massively multilingual. So there's 100, and I'll probably forget the number, but there's hundreds of languages spoken in the borough of Hackney. And that means that through many immigrant populations. And that means that the children of these various speakers, they don't have a language which is effectively in common with each other, right? Because what they're doing is they're learning from their parents, whatever their home language is, plus some kind of second language version of English, right? So when they come to speak to other people, they're speaking quite differently from each other, right? So you've got some people whose parents might be from Turkey and who speak a sort of Turkish influenced version of English. You might have some people whose parents speak Haitian Creole and have a Creole variety. Some speakers who might have some like Chinese and so on. So many different languages. So there's a question then. So what happens when you take all of these kids and you put them together? What kind of a language emerges? Is it just a hodgepodge? Is it just a mess? Or is it structured like all the other languages we know are structured into, particular grammatical rules? So you'll not be surprised probably that it's the latter. So the case I want to tell you about is something that my colleague Jenny Cheshire noticed when she was looking at the data of teenage speakers from Hackney. So what the team did was they collected loads and loads and loads of data and then analysed it statistically. And one of the things that Jenny was looking at is what's called a relative clause. So this is where I come in as a syntactician. So a relative clause is when you take a noun like the cat and then you add a clause after it. So you say the cat that I love, or the dog that jumped on me. So you've got these extra little bits, right? So the dog that jumped on me, that's the relative clause. So relative clauses in English, when they modify a noun which is human, so let's take something like the man or the woman, say the woman who I saw, you can say the woman who I saw. You can also say the woman that I saw, you can say who or that, and you can also say the woman I saw. So 3 different ways of doing relative clauses, and they're all completely normal in day-to-day English, and everyone uses them in conversationally, just at a random in a kind of random collection of ways, when you have a human noun that you're talking about. So what Jenny noticed when she looked at this was that in the teenage speech of the children from Hackney, is that actually they were using it differently than speakers of other varieties of English do. As I said, those 3 kinds of relative clause introduction, who, that, and nothing, are not really, they're not really grammatically organized in standard varieties of English. There's some prescriptive norms. If you've got human, you should use a who. So second language speakers of English often get told that, but it's just not true. That's not what people do. People use that and they use who. So in standard English, you use all of them. But what Jenny noticed with or what our team noticed with the Hackney teenagers is that they began to use who when the noun, the person that the noun referred to, right? You've got a noun, refers to a person, when that person was an ongoing topic of the conversation, right? So if you imagine someone who's really important, or you're talking about someone who's really important to you, and you say, oh, that man I met at the party, or that man who I met at the party, and then you continue talking about him. He was this guy that turned up late and no one talked to him, and then when I saw him the next day, he gets talked about a lot. He's an ongoing topic, okay? Or you can imagine someone isn't an ongoing topic, right? Oh, those people in the bus, they were really upset when the bus blew up and something terrible happened and everyone ran away and da-da-da. But you don't talk about the people again, you're talking about something else. What Jenny noticed was that these Hackney teenagers were structuring the two kinds of relative clause in a completely different way than normal English. So they were using who when the noun was a topic of the ongoing discourse. So you can count the number of times that noun is referred back to, and the more it's referred back to, the more likely it is that the person used who in their relative clause. Now it turns out it's even more interesting than this. So that's a new rule. It's not, no one taught the kids this, right? It's a new rule that they kind of worked out themselves, okay? Where did it come from? So that's a really interesting question. Now it turns out that in these various languages that are spoken by the kids that are not English, many languages have ways of expressing topicality. So, Japanese does, for example, it uses a particular particle. Creoles do, they have a particular way of changing the verb. But there's various kinds of ways that languages mark that something's a topic. English doesn't do that, right? Except for these Hackney kids. So what seems to have happened is that what these kids have done is it's like there's this floating feature around. It's like grammatical concept of topic that other languages are using, and it's not being used in English. And the kids, because they're not getting full input in English, they're getting second language English, what they're doing when they're talking to each other is reorganizing the way they're speaking and taking advantage of this kind of floating feature that's around, okay? And so they use that to organize their own grammar. And it turns out that it's even more specific than this. So the more multilingual and multi-ethnic you are, right? If you've got tons and tons of friends who all speak second languages, right? Then you're much more likely to use this grammatical rule, this new grammatical rule, than if you've got mainly, monolingual friends. So it really turns out to be the case that, it's in a sense an expression of your identity as a Hackney teenager, completely subconscious. You don't know you're doing this, right? But it expresses who you are when you start using this grammatical rule like that. So that's really interesting, I think, because what it shows is the emergence of a new rule, and that new rule emerges through social factors, right? It emerges through the ways that people interact with each other, the ways that they want to be close to each other, and it's done completely unconsciously. They don't know they're doing this. You can see it in the data if you look, right? You can see in the data that this new rule has appeared, but they don't know they're doing this. And that's how all language works, right? When I'm putting these sentences together right now, I don't know what rules I'm using to put them together. I just put them together and they work, and I'm not conscious of the rules. I can make myself conscious, and because I'm a linguist, I probably do know a lot of those rules, but people can speak perfectly well without knowing them. And what's happening in this group of Hackney teenagers is they've innovated, they've added a new rule into their system, and that is as much part of the nature of language, right? This creation of new grammatical rules from social factors as the very nature of the rules themselves.
So cognitive neuroscience is an area that's expanding in its influence and tackling many phenomena that previously were left to psychologists or educators and sociologists. One of the examples of a recent area where cognitive neuroscience has offered new insights is the area of socioeconomic status and the way it influences cognitive and brain development. Now, we know that the environment can influence children's development, both physically, emotionally, and cognitively. Exactly what factors in the environment are influencing children? As scientists, we like to have things that we can measure. One of the measures we can take from the environment that seems to explain a fair amount of the variability in children's development is socioeconomic status. Now, socioeconomic status is a kind of construct. It combines multiple aspects, but broadly it's characterizing a family. It's characterizing in that family the amount of economic resources they have, but also aspects of social hierarchy, of prestige, of power. So typically in studies we might measure it by looking at the level of the parent's education, or we might look at the family income. One of the most striking features of socioeconomic status on children's development is that by the time children start school, you can already see big gaps in the behaviors and the cognitive abilities, say the vocabulary size of children according to the socioeconomic status, or I'll call it SES, the SES of the families they come from. And once children start school, 3, 4, 5 years of age, those gaps, they don't narrow. They often persist throughout the school years. So there's a big concern there. What are these influences of socioeconomic status? How are they impacting on children? And what can we do about that to try and close the gaps caused by the differences in family background? So that is the goal of cognitive neuroscience, to understand mechanisms. If we understand causes, that enables us to try and intervene and to figure out the easiest way to ameliorate, to reduce the consequences on children's development of these differences in family background. So if you look at behavior, what's interesting about the effects of SES on behavior is that they're uneven across different abilities. In fact, that's one of the puzzles. For instance, there was one study by Daniel Hackman and Martha Farah suggested that perhaps a third of the variation in children's vocabulary size, their language development, can be explained by socioeconomic status. That's a large amount of variability. If you look at areas of behavioral regulation, children's whether they can control or inhibit their cognitive functions, so-called executive functions, about 6% of the variation is explained by socioeconomic status. A similar amount is explained in the variation of their working memory ability, what they can keep in mind. But then you look at something like their visuospatial skills, working in space, remembering spatial configurations. There's not much influence of socioeconomic status on that aspect. So why is it that socioeconomic status would have that uneven kind of influence across the development of different kinds of skills in children? Ultimately, we expect socioeconomic status to have a biological influence at some level. And so one of the places we want to start is to investigate what effects socioeconomic status may have on the brain. So let me give you an example of a study, which was a large study looking at I think it was 1,000 children in the US, and this was a study led by Kimberly Noble. What they did was to scan the brain structure of these 1,000 children and look in detail at the surface area of the cortex, the thickness of the cortex, and see whether they could detect the impact of the family's socioeconomic status on children's brain structure. Now, this is a very kind of gross measure, looking at just the amount of white matter and grey matter in the brain. And the effects are quite small. The researchers needed a large sample in order to detect these differences, but ultimately they did show variations, particularly in cortical surface area, according to socioeconomic status. Interestingly, the differences they found were in temporal regions and in frontal regions of the brain. And that fits with what we see in behavior. The temporal regions of the brain are involved in language processing. The frontal regions of the brain are involved in executive function. So it fits with what we're seeing in behavior. It's also possible that those parts of the brain have the longest developmental trajectory, and maybe this long period of development for temporal and frontal regions gives the most opportunity for the environment to influence their development. A couple of other things you might say about that the effects were really quite small. There were only 1 or 2% of the variation in brain structure was being explained by socioeconomic status, even though, as I said, about a third of the variation in language development was predicted by that same variable. So it's more obvious in behavior than it is in these subtle measures of brain structure. That's just looking at structure, but you can also look at the function of the brain. So one of the things we can do is to measure the electrical activity going on in the brain by measuring it at the scalp using electrodes. These are very small voltages, and what you can do is to see changes in those voltages as children carry out tasks. So there was a study carried out by Courtney Stevens and Helen Neville, where they played children different sounds, and they were only supposed to pay attention to one of the sounds and ignore the other sound. And children from a low socioeconomic status background, their brains were less able to ignore, to screen out the information that they were not supposed to pay attention to. So the suggestion there was that there was a problem in selective attention in those children. So both evidence on brain structure and evidence on brain function that socioeconomic status is having an effect at a biological level. Well, we have to think about how that's going to work. What is the actual pathway between which you have these things that you measure in the environment and these effects on brain structure and brain function? Here as scientists, we run into a bit of a problem. So the problem is we like to detect correlations, and they suggest causal pathways. But what we have with socioeconomic status is a kind of a mashing together of lots of correlated factors in the environment. The family that has fewer resources, that they're poorer, the parents may be less educated, the household may be in a poorer neighborhood, it may be a less structured household, there may be fewer resources, fewer books, fewer toys, and maybe the parents interact with the children differently, they're more stressed, they have less quality time with the children. The parents may be less healthy, they're having to work longer hours for lower wages. It may be that when the mother was pregnant, that maybe she was more stressed, maybe her nutrition wasn't as high, maybe she has a baby with a lower birth weight, maybe it's more likely that she gets depressed afterwards. So you find a lot of these factors correlated with socioeconomic status. Which of those is having an effect on brain development and behavioral development? It's difficult to answer these questions, and neuroscience is using a set of different methods. We talked about brain imaging, but also looking at animal models and computational models of the development of neural systems to try and understand the pathways by which this can take place. So typically we pull apart two different influences on families. We think about the level of stress in the family, and these are kind of toxic effects of stress. We also think about the level of resources and opportunities in the family. And then we map those into some possible causal pathways affecting brain development, and those are roughly of three different types. You can think of prenatal effects on a child's development. These are effects that will happen when the mother is pregnant. Maybe she's more stressed, has poorer nutrition, maybe she's more likely to smoke or drink. These are effects on the development of the embryo. The second type of effect would be postnatal parenting, the nature of the relationship between the parent and the child and the nurturing that's happening. And then another type would be the level of cognitive stimulation, how rich the experiences are for the child. So these three different pathways. So we don't exactly know which are responsible, and there might be different contributions of those causal pathways, perhaps to different groups, perhaps to rural poor versus urban poor. But here's one possibility about how it might work. We find slightly higher incidences of developmental disorders like dyslexia and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in children from poorer backgrounds. Maybe those are more to do with the prenatal effects. Where children have more behavioral problems and they can't regulate their emotions, maybe that's coming more from the early parenting and the early nurturing. And maybe when we see differences in language development, maybe that's differences in stimulation in the environment. And then maybe children's just natural experience in the physical world is enough to allow their spatial skills to develop sort of independently from their socioeconomic status. So in this study of socioeconomic status from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, it is important to distinguish between two different viewpoints. You can think of the effects of deprivation and poverty as a sort of deficit. And maybe that would be right if you're thinking about the effects of chronic stress or the effects of poor nutrition. But you can also think sometimes in terms of adaptation, of children behaving in the way they do given the environment they're in. So a child in a more threatening environment, a more stressful environment, perhaps they need to be more vigilant. So they can't focus their attention, they can't afford to focus their attention, they need to be monitoring more widely. So maybe that's an adaptation rather than a deficit. And maybe the way children make decisions and regulate their behavior is because for them they're in a scarce environment and there's no point in having long-term planning, they need to take what's in front of them. So we need to think carefully about what are deficits and what are adaptations. And the final thing to say about a cognitive neuroscience approach to the effects of poverty is just because we're finding effects in the brain doesn't somehow make them immutable, like they're inevitable. There's good evidence that interventions working with families as well as with children to improve the way parents interact with children, to target more resources to those families, can have long-lasting beneficial effects on children's development.
Laughter is very interesting because it's a very widespread human behaviour and there's very, very little research into it. So if I go on to one of the databases for academic papers like Web of Science and I put in the search terms emotion, expression, fear, I get back about 4,000 papers. There are loads of papers looking at how fear is recognised and what fear does. If I put in the term emotion, expression, laughter, I get back about 135 papers. And most of those are academic papers describing clinical problems where people have pathological laughter. There are very, very few academic sort of experimental studies of laughter. And it's a very interesting behaviour because we haven't looked at it academically, there's just not much interest in it. But actually it's everywhere. People laugh very, very frequently. And Robert Provine, working in the US, has found that people, if you ask people, when do you laugh, what do you laugh at, they talk about jokes and humour and comedy. If you look at people, what you find is they laugh when they're with other people. It's a social behaviour. So most laughter actually is not found at humour per se, it's found in conversations. It happens when people are talking to each other. And in fact, he's even found within those conversations, most of the laughter is still not at jokes. People laugh at comments and statements like, I'll have another cup of coffee, or I might miss my bus. And in fact, at any one time, he's found that the person who laughs most is normally the person who's speaking. It's part of their communicative act. So it's very interesting. It's kind of everything we think it's not. We think it's about jokes and humour, but actually it's a social behaviour. And when we're talking to somebody and we laugh with someone we're talking to, we're showing them that we like them. We're showing that we understand them, we agree with them, we're part of the same social group as them. You're doing all this kind of like affiliative social work with laughter. In the middle of speech and language, you kind of interleave this non-verbal vocal behaviour, because laughter is part of a class of vocalisations like screaming and making disgusted sounds, which are more like animal calls than they are like speech. So you're kind of flipping into this animal call behaviour in the middle of human speech. So it's very unusual and quite strange like that, and very, very common. One of the other findings is that people consistently underestimate how often they laugh. If you ask people how often you laugh, they will say, give you a number. If you actually then go out and watch them, they laugh all the time. They laugh. They always laugh more than they think they do. And it's so strongly driven by social context, you get 30 times more likely to laugh if there is somebody else with you than if you're on your own. So it's really strongly driven by social phenomena. So I find it a very interesting behaviour, because I've been studying speech for years and years and years, and I've looked at perception, I've looked at production, and I'd completely separately been looking at these emotional vocalisations like screams and yuck sounds and cheers. And within that, I started to look more at laughter, because I was interested in sort of positive emotions. And then as soon as you start looking at that, you realise it's everywhere. And people don't scream very often, but actually they laugh a lot. So it is a very, very interesting behaviour. And it does seem to be something that has, for example, a lot of that behaviour you learn. So one of the phenomena with laughter is it's contagious. So you are very likely, particularly if you know somebody, to catch a laugh from them, even if you don't know why they're laughing. So if your friend starts laughing, you'll probably start laughing, even if you don't know why they're laughing. And that behavioural contagion is something you learn to do. Babies don't laugh contagiously. Babies learn. We teach babies to laugh when other people laugh. That's not specific to laughter, that's also true for yawning. There's a whole set of behavioural contagious things we do that are sort of affiliative. They're basically showing familiarity. You do it with people you know rather than people you don't know. But that's there for laughter, and we hardly notice it. We just think, you know, we're laughing with our friends. We don't never think, well, I don't know why they're laughing, but I am also laughing. So my work on this, for a long time, I was working on vocal expressions of emotion, and I was working on negative emotions, because that's what we study. You know, we study things like fear and anger and disgust. And I got very interested in why this was the case. I was interested in why everything we studied in psychology and neuroscience, when we talk about emotion, pretty much without exception, we mean negative emotions. And I started to look into it, and people had made claims that there would be, you know, there might be important positive emotions that we should look at. So I started looking at them, and I was looking at how they're expressed with the voice, because I work with voices. And that's when laughter started to look quite different. So, for example, we did a cross-cultural study looking at which emotions are recognised from the voice in cultures that have never encountered a European person making noises at them. My PhD student went off to work with the Himba in northern Namibia. What she found was, as has been shown from the face, people in completely different cultures can recognise the emotions of fear, anger, disgust, sadness and surprise. All the other work's been done with the face, and she was doing it with the voice. So people in the middle of the Namibian desert, if they hear a sobbing sound, they know what that means. She also tested positive emotions, and the only positive emotion which was recognised cross-culturally, so the people in the middle of the Namibian desert recognised it, and when we recorded them, people back in the UK recognised that also, was laughter. So laughter really is a universal vocal signal of an emotion. It means it might be used differently in different cultures, because that's what humans do, but the basic recognition is there. People know about laughter, and they know it when they hear it. It has the same basic meaning. In terms of brain activation, laughter is also very interesting. So I mentioned that laughter is very contagious, and you can actually see that if you scan people listening to laughter. You can see the brain getting ready to join in a way that people don't if they hear a disgusted sound like ugh, which is emotionally meaningful, but it's not behaviourally contagious. You don't join in with it. So you can actually see that happening. And in fact, what we've found is that across people, the more people show this kind of contagion effect when they listen to laughter, the better they are at working out what laughter means. So if we play them a recording of somebody laughing spontaneously or faking their laughter, the people who show a stronger contagion response in their brain are better at spotting that difference. So it's not just contagion, there's a sort of getting ready to join in with laughter helps you understand what laughter means. So there's almost an emotional intelligence component to this. So this is something we're very interested in. We're very interested in these individual differences in laughter and how that might relate to experience and also brain function. So we've worked, for example, with children with conduct disorders who do show a different neural response to the contagion effects in laughter, and we've done some behavioural work with people with depression who find laughter a lot less contagious than people who aren't depressed. So it's a very interesting tool because it's a social emotion. You find it in interactions. It lets us map between the social world and the emotional world which normally we kind of treat as somewhat differently, but actually laughter sits squarely in the middle, and it's also very, very commonly encountered. So if somebody has an unusual reaction to laughter in conversations, what effect does that have on the whole interaction? If they don't join in when they hear laughter, or if they find laughter irritating or upsetting, how does that affect what then goes on? So there's a lot more to know, but I'm very interested in it as an emotional and as a social signal, and it does seem to recruit quite different brain networks from, say, other emotional sounds. One of the interesting things about laughter is that we are not the only animals that laugh. So laughter has actually been described in other apes, but it's even been described in rats. And it's probably more of it out there, it's just that no one's really been looking for it. And very interestingly, if you're a human or an ape or a rat, you first see laughter emerging in the same context, which is when babies are tickled by adults, normally their parents. And you don't see that happening, but laughter doesn't sort of emerge on its own, it happens in these interactions. So it's the earliest emergence. Laughter is essentially a social bonding phenomenon. And as we get older, it becomes associated with play. So rats laugh when they play, and chimpanzees laugh when they play, and humans laugh when they play. So, and that's a huge aspect of development for juvenile mammals. Play is incredibly important. And then it's got this rich social life for adult humans. But interestingly, adult humans have got two different sorts of laugh. Adult humans laugh differently if they're laughing really helplessly, spontaneously, than if they're laughing in conversation, which is very controlled, voluntary laughter. They sound different, and people know what they mean. They know they mean different things. Interestingly, chimpanzees do the exact same thing. Chimpanzees have two different laughs. They laugh differently if they're being tickled than if they're trying to make play last longer. So that really does look a lot like the human sort of social laughter versus the human spontaneous laughter. So actually, the parallels with apes might be really quite close. So the kind of interaction that you're having with somebody does affect how laughter works. And there was quite an interesting study a few years ago showing people having conversations. They were just having conversational interactions, and they either did it face-to-face in the room with each other, or face-to-face, but they were on a FaceTime or Skype. There was a screen involved. Or they were talking on the phone, or they were having text messages. And what they found was people talked for longer, laughed more, and were happier afterwards when they'd had the face-to-face interaction, whether or not the person was in the room with them. So they laughed as much, talked for as long, and were as happy afterwards if they'd had a screen-based conversation. But if they could see and hear the person and it's happening in real time, that's when you get most laughter. If you go down to just the voice, there's less laughter because you've lost all the facial information, I think. And then when you go down to words, just words on a screen, that's when you get least laughter. And that's probably because you're just taking away more and more social information. And very interestingly, if you look at how people interact with words, like on their phones or on Twitter or whatever, people try and put laughter back in. They use smiley faces, they use exclamation points, they use lol or ruffle or rufflecopter. This whole kind of world of different sounds. This whole kind of world of different visual indications that they're really laughing, because you can't hear or see the laughter, but you try and put it back in there. I think probably the future is everything, in that we hardly know anything about laughter. We've just done so little work on it. There's a great deal more to understand. One of the things I'd really like to understand is how the neural control of laughter works when you're actually producing it. How is that different if you're laughing helplessly and you can't stop than if you're laughing politely in a conversation? How is that working? How is that interleaved with the control of speech? I think it's going to be very important to understand how laughter relates to development. So we know from the rat literature that the more a rat is tickled when it's a baby, the more it will laugh when it's tickled as an adult. So can we see anything like that in humans? Can we see this potentiation? And of course, although laughter is cross-culturally recognised, it is used differently in different cultures. So people can find British people smile too much, for example, or laugh too much in certain cultures, and British people can find me a bit kind of all at sea, like why do people think I'm silly because I'm laughing all the time? And other cultures, it's extremely impolite to laugh. So actually, these kind of does it affect how people process laughter? And is it just a kind of like a display rule about where you do and don't do this behaviour? So I've emphasised the fact that you find laughter everywhere and all human cultures use laughter, but actually how they use it can be very different.